You're listening to the Quint podcast.
Along with renaming the Ministry of Human Resource Development, or the MHRD, as the Ministry of Education, the Union government unveiled the new Education Policy 2020. The announcements are plenty. Mphil is scrapped, 4-year undergraduate program is back, vocational training is mandated in schools, teaching in mother tongue or regional languages is advised at school levels, board exams have been played down, and much more. 34 years after the National Education Policy was formulated in 1986, these are the first major reforms that it's going through. From an overall perspective, the new policy announced by the Modi government on 29th July aims to overhaul the Indian education system with an emphasis on access to education, attempt to move away from rote learning, reforms at all levels from school to higher education, and reducing the number of regulators for higher education. But as we drown under all the information of the myriads of changes that are being suggested, the devil is in the detail. How is the new education policy, or the NEP, being received? Does it address the gaps in the current education system? You're tuned in to The Big Story, the podcast where we dissect the headline-making news for you. And I'm your host, Shorburi. As I said, there's a myriad of changes under the new Education Policy 2020. So I'll be doing this episode in two parts. In the first part, we'll dissect the big reform announcements on schools. And in this episode, I'll be joined by Angela Taneja, who's the campaign lead of Inequality Education and Health at Oxfam India, and Ashish Dhawan, the founder and chairman of Central Square Foundation, and also the founding member of Ashoka University. In the next part, that is the next episode of The Big Story, we'll talk about the policy reforms for higher education. So let's jump right into the biggest highlights of the NEP reforms for schools. Number one, moving away from the current 10+2 formula that is followed for schooling, the NEP's new school system will be a 5+3+3+4 formula. It takes into account the early childhood care, so that's 5 years of foundational learning from 3 years of age, preparatory school from classes 3 to 5, middle school from classes 6 to 8, and secondary school from 9 to 12. That means even government schools may offer elementary education now. Next, activity-based learning will be encouraged, and students from classes 6 and above would be taught coding to improve mathematical efficiency. Similarly, vocational training will be provided to students in classes 6 and above, where they can intern with a local skills person. Number 3, there's an emphasis on the use of mother tongue or local languages or regional languages as the medium of instruction till class 5, while recommending the continuance till class 8 and beyond. Does that mean that any language will be imposed on any student? Unfortunately, the draft doesn't clarify to what extent a student will be able to choose a particular language. Sanskrit will be offered at all levels of school and higher education as an option for students, including in the 3-language formula. Other classical languages and literature of India will also be available as options. Number 4, board exams. This is something that is much debated on year after year. Are board exams too much pressure on students? Should we do away with it? Should we not? Well, to move away from rote learning, board exams will be a test on knowledge application rather than rote learning. They can be held twice a year, and report cards of students would be based on self, peer and teacher review. So as the draft puts it, what we see in here is an attempt to make these exams easier. So what are the first reactions to the school education reforms? I called up Angela Taneja, who's the campaign lead at Oxfam India, to ask her about her takeaways.
So what do I think about the policy? Well, there is the good to see survive, the bad and the confusing. If one looks at the good, it's great to see more emphasis on early childhood education. It's good to see that the board exams are being made less high stakes, and there's a much more humanistic vision of education that seems to come through. It's great to see more emphasis on instruction in the mother tongue. Great to see some more thinking on the issues of teachers that have long been neglected. At the same time, there were concerns that some provisions may not survive in the last draft. So it's great to see the commitment to 6% GDP which are being committed, I might add, since the Kothari Commission, since before, I guess most of us were born, are still part of the policy. Hasn't been implemented, but great to see at least it not be removed. It's great to see at least the language on fighting commercialization. Again, there have been demands around the making education a for-profit area. Great to see that this has at least in principle been something that the committee has not given support to. Great to see that the three language formula is still there. But having said so, there is the bad. Overall, one gets a sense of the government's policy moving from a commitment to equitable quality provision for all to a model of strengthening the system through competition. Therefore, there is the risk of creeping privatization. There is clearly a sense of promoting private education. Yes, they do differentiate between philanthropic and non-philanthropic education, but the legal framework for India already says all education is not for profit. Therefore, I really don't see what is a non-philanthropic private education in India, given the current legal framework, which hasn't changed so far. And above all, it's the test of any framework is its implementation. Therefore, don't get a sense of whether the implementation modalities of rolling out the framework and the policy have been completely thought through.
Ashish Dhawan, the founder and chairman of Central Square Foundation and also a founding member of Ashoka University, also talks about what he thinks are the salient points of these reforms. He says that the de-emphasis on board exams especially intends to reform the learning process.
Yeah, so firstly, let me say that the new education policy is a landmark document. The last one came out 34 years ago, and this will probably live for at least another 20 years. So it needs to be forward-thinking, visionary, it's a guidepost, etc. All of that's in there is not going to be done, overnight. So it's more of it's a policy at this, or it's a guiding policy at this stage. I think in terms of board exams, we all know that we're trapped in this mode of rote examinations, and that cascades back into the education system, not only in high school, but also into middle school, because people start getting ready for the board exams, as it were. And it's very, very high stakes. Your life depends on it. Absolutely. And so I think what's addressed here is, one is, how can we make it lower stakes? Two is, how do you make it more application oriented and testing core concepts as opposed to rote memorization? And I think that's fantastic, because what is the purpose of education at the end of the day? It's so that students really get an exposure to a broad number of disciplines. They understand the core concepts. They know how to apply it in the real world. And they have some fundamental skills like the ability to read, write, do basic mental math, etc. And so I think this will be a game changer when it's implemented. The good news is, under the former chairperson, CBSE had already started on its reform journey. And I know the current chairperson is further accelerating that. And so if the CBSE starts leading with this, I'm certain that other state boards will also follow in this direction.
Now, to deep dive into an analysis of some of these specific reforms, if I could just go back to the point on vocational training. The policies have been overhauled to provide a skill-based learning or learning by doing from school level. But since there's no clarity on how it will be implemented exactly, do we risk into reinforcing gender or caste or class-based roles through these skills? For example, will it mean specific skills for urban population and something else for the rural population? Ms. Taneja weighs in.
The current reality is vocational education for girls sets them into gendered roles. SC and ST communities are again streamed into a different kind of vocational education compared to people from elite backgrounds. Thirdly, An unanswered question is the availability of trainers and infrastructure in rural areas. Sure, there would be potters and craftsmen in rural areas, but is this the vocational education that India needs for the 21st century? Is that infrastructure available in rural areas to make sure cutting edge vocational education that with 21st century skills requires? I obviously doubt it, and one doesn't get a sense of it being realized. And of course, there is a difference in the kind of facilities that would be available in elite private schools versus the mainstream schools of Bharat. Therefore, once again, there is a risk that this would promote inequality.
Coming to the point on the emphasis on learning in regional languages or mother tongue, that has been a long standing demand, especially to tackle dropouts. And this proposal has been therefore lauded by a lot of experts. But how can it enhance the learning process? Mr. Dhawan says that research shows education in mother tongue has a greater impact on learning.
Yeah. So first, the research clearly shows that if children learn get literate in their mother tongue, it's the right thing. And it's common sense because they're exposed to the oral language in the home. If Hindi is spoken in my home, it's much easier for me to learn to read and write in Hindi, because reading and writing are hard skills to acquire in the classroom. And my teacher most likely is most proficient in Hindi as well, because comes from the same local area. So I think the language thing makes sense. Research shows it's the right thing to do. Does this mean that the government's going to be prescriptive and stop private schools from English as a medium of instruction? I don't think so. Because in those private schools, the parents who send their children there, in the household, English is spoken. And so for those kids, acquiring early literacy skills in English is very possible. It's just the students who currently go to government school, they come from a different background. And so I think it addresses the issue of, if in your home, you don't have the orality, the oral language being spoken, then it's much harder to learn to read or write in that language. And so I think it's appropriate that within the government system, we do exactly as is espoused in the policy, but we provide degrees of freedom to private institutions around that, because they may have learners coming from different households and households where English is spoken as a first language or maybe some other language as well. I do want to point out that I think the single biggest game changer in this new education policy, we didn't touch on it so much, is this idea of focus on foundational literacy and numeracy. The fact that a national mission is going to be created, the fact that by 2025, the country wants to eradicate learning poverty in the early years, that every child should learn to read, write, do basic math. I think that is the fundamental building block, because about half our children are falling behind today. If we can solve this, we can really build a better economy, a more vibrant economy, and eventually a better higher education system, because it's these children who eventually flow through the system later, and we can improve our gross enrollment ratios, etc. So to me, the most important part is the part around foundation learning, and the fact that it's now going into mission mode backed by the Prime Minister.
But despite its intentions on advancing learning through the mother tongue, what we have right now is on paper. So what kind of questions does it raise on its applicability? What about linguistic minorities? What about children from bilingual families? Ms. Taneja lays out her concerns.
There's a slight confusion in how the policy seems to approach the question of languages. Mother tongue education, state language, the language spoken at home almost appear to be used synonymously. In a lot of households, they are different languages. Therefore, how would instruction happen in practice is not very clear. Great to see the three language formula survive, but in practice, given the fact that it is existing policy for decades now, how would its implementation change in practice? How would the government go about changing the monopoly of Hindi and Sanskrit to recognize and give equal emphasis to state languages, because it's not just a question of the curriculum, it's also the fact that it's also a function of the status that languages have in society. It's great to see the emphasis on classical languages, foreign languages, etc. In principle, sure, we live in a more unified world. In practice, I would be very surprised to see these foreign language teaching be taken up on scale in rural areas, in government schools. Therefore, again, the risk of this is furthering inequality between the rich and the poor.
Having said all that, it's still too early to understand how exactly these reforms will play out and how they will be implemented. But before I sign off, don't forget to tune in to the second part of this podcast on the new education policy, where we'll break down the reforms for higher education. If you like listening to this episode, please subscribe to the Big Story playlist for episodic updates. We're live on Apple, Google Podcast, Spotify, JioSaavn, and most of the other popular podcast streaming platforms. For other podcasts, please log on to the Quint website and check out the podcast section. For any feedback, shoot an email to podcasts@thequint.com.
Thanks for listening. Log on to the Quint's website and check out our other podcasts.